September 15th, 1943. Rust, Diesel, Stalebrett. That was the smell of the voyage. In the ship's hold, German prisoners tried to sleep. No chains, only exhaustion. Their boots had marched through Europe's ruins. Now they were cargo, silent, waiting. Some whispered about American cruelty. Others clung to old propaganda. But beneath it all was a silence they couldn't escape, fear hiding behind pride. The voyage across the Atlantic was no cruise. Salt air stung their throats. The groaning of the hull reminded them with each wave how fragile their situation was. Above deck, guards paced with rifles, their uniforms crisp and alien. Below, the prisoners tried not to imagine torpedoes, for the war at sea still raged. But it wasn't torpedoes that haunted them most. It was hunger. Their rations, stale bread, thin soup ladled without care, did nothing to quiet stomachs used to years of scarcity. In Germany, ration cards had already become prayers written on paper. Here, in the belly of the ship, those prayers became gnawing pain. When a ship finally made harbor, they expected the smell of ash and gunpowder, a shore bristling with barbed wire and snarling guards. Instead, as the gangplank clattered down, they were hit with something else entirely. The mingled aromas of coffee, roasted meat, and fresh-cut lumber from the docks. To men who had marched through burned villages, that smell was a shock in itself. For the first time since capture, their eyes lifted. America did not look like a land at war. It looked impossibly whole. Klaus pressed his face against the ship's rail, staring at warehouses intact, cranes moving smoothly, workers who seemed unhurried. Heinrich whispered beside him, "How can they be so untouched?" The journey inland began with trains. Boxcars rolled through plains so vast the men pressed against the slats just to glimpse the horizon. In Germany, the horizon meant shellfire or rubble. Here was cornfields, endless and golden, dotted with barns painted red, as if from children's drawings. They passed towns where neon lights glowed at night, something many had never seen. They muttered among themselves. How could a country so far from the front be so untouched, so plentiful? And why did the guards not sneer, not strike, not bark orders with cruelty? Their silence was not friendly, but it was strangely patient, as if the Americans had no need to prove themselves. At last, the train slowed. A camp waited, a stretch of land fenced, but not festooned with barbed cruelty. Watchtowers present, but oddly unthreatening, barracks lined in neat rows like some farmers' outbuildings. The prisoners shuffled through gates, expecting a harsh welcome. Instead, a sergeant with a clipboard spoke in curt but fair tones, organizing them into groups. They were issued bedding, soap, and clothing that, though plain, was cleaner and sturdier than what most had worn in months. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, not of fear. Then came the first meal. The line moved into a mess hall where tin trays clattered against metal. At first they assumed it was another cruel joke. The portions seemed impossible. White bread, thick slices that caught the light. Real butter, not the gray substitute they remembered from home. Soup that steamed with actual meat floating in clear broth. Klaus stared at his tray, afraid to touch it. In Germany, bread like this existed only in memories from before the war. Heinrich picked up a slice, examining it as if it might vanish. The texture was soft, almost sweet, nothing like the sawdust mixture they'd choked down for years. Werner, older than the others, sat rigid at his table. He'd been a baker before the war, knew good bread from propaganda. This was real. His hands trembled as he bit into the slice. The taste hit him like a physical blow. Moisture, wheat, actual grain. Around the mess hall, similar scenes played out in silence. Men who had marched through Poland, France, Russia, now reduced to tears by bread. Some wept openly, others hid their faces. The emotional release was overwhelming, confusing, shameful. American guards watched from the corners, their expressions unreadable. They'd seen this before, the breakdown that came when starving men encountered abundance. It wasn't pity in their eyes, but something closer to professional observation. Why? Heinrich whispered to Klaus. Why feed us like this? Klaus shook his head. In the propaganda films, American camps were described as death factories. Prisoners worked until they collapsed, fed scraps, beaten for sport. This meal made no sense in that narrative. The butter was the breaking point for many. Rich, yellow, spread thick on bread that didn't crumble. Werner pressed his face into his hands, shoulders shaking. He thought of his wife rationing their last bit of lard, making it last weeks. Here, butter was casual, abundant, wasted. A young prisoner, barely 18, began laughing through his tears. The sound was unsettling, hysterical. Guards moved closer, alert, but the boy wasn't dangerous. He was simply overwhelmed by the contradiction between expectation and reality. Klaus forced himself to eat slowly, methodically. Each bite felt like betrayal. His family in Munich was surviving on turnip soup and ersatz coffee. His sister wrote about children too weak to play. Yet here he sat, a prisoner, eating better than any German civilian. The psychological warfare was more effective than any torture. This kindness, this abundance, it attacked everything they'd been told about their enemies. Americans were supposed to be barbaric, vengeful, cruel. Instead, they provided beds, soap, and meals that surpassed what German soldiers received. Heinrich managed a few words between bites. This changes everything. Klaus nodded, understanding. The bread in his mouth wasn't just food. It was evidence that their entire worldview might be built on lies. If Americans weren't monsters, what else had they been told that wasn't true? The meal ended in confused silence. Men filed out, carrying questions heavier than hunger. In the barracks that night, whispered conversations continued until dawn, prisoners trying to reconcile propaganda with the taste of real butter on their tongues. 3 days later, during evening meal service, something new appeared on their trays. Small brown squares wrapped in foil, and jars of thick, brown paste that none of them recognized. The guards demonstrated casually, spreading the paste on bread, unwrapping the squares and biting into them. Chocolate, Hershey's chocolate, and peanut butter. Werner picked up the chocolate bar with shaking fingers. The wrapper crinkled, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the mess hall. He'd forgotten chocolate existed. In Germany, such luxuries had vanished by 1940, reserved for high-ranking officials or traded on black markets for impossible prices. The first bite destroyed him completely. Sweetness flooded his mouth, rich and overwhelming. His body, starved of sugar for years, reacted violently. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he chewed, unable to stop himself from sobbing. Around him, other prisoners were experiencing similar breakdowns. Klaus stared at the peanut butter jar, reading the English label he couldn't understand. He dipped his finger into the paste, tasting it cautiously. The flavor was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Rich, nutty, almost impossibly dense with calories and fat. Heinrich couldn't swallow his chocolate. He held it in his mouth, letting it melt slowly, afraid that swallowing would end the experience. When he finally did, he immediately unwrapped another piece, then another, eating with desperate hunger that had nothing to do with nourishment. The emotional collapse was complete and public. Men who had maintained military bearing through capture, transport, and imprisonment now wept openly over candy bars. Guards watched with expressions that mixed professional detachment with human discomfort. Werner thought of his daughter in Berlin. 8 years old, she'd written that she dreamed about apples. Just apples. Simple fruit had become fantasy. Yet here he sat, a prisoner, eating chocolate like a privileged child at Christmas. "This is wrong," Klaus whispered, but he couldn't stop eating. The peanut butter stuck to the roof of his mouth, forcing him to work his tongue around it. The sensation was almost obscene in its richness. A young prisoner named Dieter began laughing hysterically between bites of chocolate. The sound echoed off the mess hall walls, unsettling everyone. Guards moved closer, hands resting on weapons, but Dieter wasn't dangerous. He was simply overwhelmed by the cosmic unfairness of eating luxury while his family starved. Heinrich managed to speak through his tears. "My mother, she's been saving potato peels for soup. And I'm eating chocolate. The guilt was crushing, but not enough to stop them from eating. Each bite drove the contradiction deeper. Their enemies treated them better than their own government ever had. American prisoners of war received abundance, while German civilians ate bark bread and boiled nettles. Werner carefully wrapped his remaining chocolate, saving it, not from discipline, but from a desperate need to make the experience last. The sweetness lingered on his tongue, a taste that would haunt him through sleepless nights, forcing him to confront everything he believed about this war and these people who were supposed to be monsters. Days blended into routine. Morning formation, work details, meals that continued to astound with their abundance. The prisoners began to move through the camp with less suspicion, though confusion deepened with each passing hour. Klaus found himself assigned to kitchen duty, where he witnessed the staggering waste that American abundance produced. Entire loaves of bread discarded for being day-old, meat portions trimmed and thrown away, vegetables peeled so thick that half the nutrition went into garbage bins. In Germany, such waste would have been criminal. Here it was Tuesday. Werner worked in the camp workshop, repairing furniture and equipment. The tools were good quality, well-maintained, plentiful. No one hoarded screws or worried about rationing wood. American guards treated supplies as infinite resources rather than precious commodities. Heinrich drew laundry duty, washing uniforms and bedding in machines that used actual soap, hot water, and electricity without reservation. Back home, his wife washed clothes in cold water with sand when soap ran out. Here, detergent flowed freely, creating mountains of suds that seemed almost theatrical in their excess. The psychological warfare intensified daily, not through cruelty, but through relentless demonstration that everything they'd been told about American weakness was false. This wasn't a nation struggling to survive. This was a country so wealthy it could afford to feed its enemies chocolate. During evening discussions in the barracks, questions multiplied faster than answers. If America possessed such abundance, why hadn't Germany's leaders mentioned it? If Americans were capable of such generosity toward prisoners, what did that say about German propaganda regarding Allied brutality? Werner voiced what many were thinking. They told us Americans were soft, decadent, weak. But soft people don't build camps this efficient. Weak people don't win wars while maintaining such abundance. Klaus nodded, remembering his sister's letters describing children too malnourished to attend school. Meanwhile, he'd watch American guards casually discard half-eaten meals that would have fed his family for days. Dieter, still processing his chocolate breakdown, raised the most dangerous question. What if we're not just wrong about Americans? What if we're wrong about everything? The silence that followed was heavier than hunger. These men had devoted years to the Reich's vision, had marched across continents believing in German superiority. Now they sat in an enemy camp, better fed and clothed than they'd been in their own army. A new prisoner arrived that week, fresh from the Russian front. His stories of German retreat, of supplies running out, of soldiers eating their boot leather, contrasted sharply with the camp's abundance. Klaus watched this newcomer experience the same shock they'd all felt, the same breakdown when confronted with American plenty. The pattern was becoming clear. Germany was losing because it was poor. America was winning because it was rich. The ideology meant nothing if you couldn't feed your army. Propaganda couldn't substitute for peanut butter. Personal stories emerged as prisoners began sharing backgrounds with sympathetic guards. Sergeant Miller, a farmer's son from Pennsylvania, found himself in conversation with Klaus during kitchen duty. The language barrier was thick, but understanding grew through shared gestures and broken phrases. Klaus tried to explain his family situation, drawing pictures on scraps of paper. A sister, thin-line sketched to show her emaciation. A mother, bent with worry. A father missing since Stalingrad. Miller nodded gravely, then showed his own family photograph. Wife, children, parents, all well-fed, all smiling, all intact. The contrast was devastating. Werner opened up to Guard Captain Thompson about his bakery in Munich. Before the war, he'd created beautiful pastries, wedding cakes, bread that made people smile. Now his shop was rubble, his ovens cold, his customers scattered or dead. Thompson listened with genuine interest, asking about techniques, recipes, traditions. This human connection was more dangerous than any interrogation. These Americans weren't monsters enjoying German suffering. They were men with families, trades, dreams disrupted by war. They showed photographs, shared stories, treated prisoners like people rather than enemies. Heinrich broke down completely when describing his children to Guard Roberts. His youngest daughter, barely 5, had written asking when Daddy would bring candy home. Heinrich had laughed bitterly reading that letter, knowing candy didn't exist in Germany anymore. Roberts quietly slipped him extra chocolate bars, saying nothing, understanding everything. The moral crisis deepened daily. Klaus ate American abundance, while his sisters survived on turnip soup. He wore clean clothes while his mother patched rags. He slept in heated barracks while his family huddled in bombed basements. The guilt was crushing, but the kindness was real. Dieter confessed to anyone who would listen that he no longer understood the war. If Americans were evil, why did they treat prisoners with dignity? If Germany was winning, why were German families starving while American guards shared personal food from home? The guards themselves were conflicted. Some expressed genuine sympathy for prisoner families suffering in Germany. Others wondered aloud why they were feeding enemy soldiers better than many American civilians ate. The contradictions affected everyone. One evening, Miller brought Klaus a letter from his own wife, translated into broken German by a camp interpreter. She'd written about harvest time, about abundance so great that food rotted in fields because there weren't enough workers to collect it all. Klaus wept reading about such impossible plenty. Werner saved every piece of chocolate, every photograph, every kind gesture, not as souvenirs, but as evidence that his entire worldview had been built on lies. These weren't the monsters described in propaganda. These were human beings capable of extraordinary generosity toward their enemies. The transformation was accelerating. Fear was being replaced by confusion, confusion by gratitude, gratitude by a dangerous question that no prisoner dared voice completely. If they'd been wrong about Americans, what else had they been wrong about? Letters home were allowed, causing further turmoil as prisoners struggled with what to tell families. Klaus stared at blank paper for hours, pen trembling in his hand. How could he describe eating chocolate while his sister starved? How could he explain being treated with dignity by enemies who were supposed to be barbaric? He wrote carefully, knowing censors would read everything. Dear Anna, I am alive and well. The Americans treat us according to Geneva Convention. I eat regularly and have warm shelter. Please take care of Mother. I think of you daily. The words felt like betrayal, not lies, but incomplete truths that couldn't capture the psychological warfare of kindness. He couldn't write about crying over Hershey bars or questioning everything they'd been taught about American cruelty. Werner chose honesty that would pass censors. Labeling, I work in a workshop here, repairing furniture. The tools are good quality. I am learning new techniques. The guards are professional. I hope your bakery space can be rebuilt when I return. Heinrich struggled most with his letter. His children expected heroic resistance stories, tales of defying brutal captors. Instead, he'd been given extra blankets when sick, shared photographs of guard families, learned English phrases from men who showed genuine interest in his welfare. My dear ones, he finally wrote, captivity is not what we expected. I remain strong for you. The Americans follow international law. I'm treated as a soldier, not an animal. Kiss the children for me. Dieter wrote to his parents with dangerous questions. Mother, Father, I am safe and fed. The Americans have much abundance here. Their cities show no war damage. Their guards carry photographs of large families, all well-fed. I am learning much about the world beyond Germany. I hope to share these lessons when I return. The camp interpreter, himself a German-American, watched these letter-writing sessions with growing concern. These weren't typical prisoner letters requesting care packages or maintaining morale. These were men grappling with worldview collapse, trying to communicate paradigm shifts without triggering censorship. Some prisoners maintained loyalty despite evidence. They wrote defiant letters praising the Reich, dismissing American abundance as temporary propaganda displays. But their voices grew quieter each week as chocolate and peanut butter spoke louder than ideology. Klaus received replies that deepened his crisis. Anna wrote about boiling leather for soup, about children too weak for school, about neighbors disappearing in night raids. Her words painted pictures of desperation while he sat in heated barracks eating imported oranges. Werner's wife described trading wedding jewelry for moldy potatoes. Meanwhile, he watched American guards discard fresh fruit because it had small bruises. The contrast was becoming unbearable. Heinrich's children sent drawings showing stick figures labeled Daddy fighting bad Americans. The innocent artwork broke his heart because those bad Americans had given him medicine when fever struck, had shared family photographs, had treated him with more humanity than his own officers ever showed. The letters became weapons more effective than any torture. Every word from home revealed the growing gap between German suffering and American abundance, between propaganda promises and prison reality. Autumn arrived in Pennsylvania, bringing continued kindness that defied all logic. Local farmers began appearing at the camp fence with donations that seemed to mock the very concept of wartime scarcity. Apple pies still warm from ovens, jars of honey that caught sunlight like liquid gold, fresh cider that tasted of orchards untouched by bombs. Klaus watched through the wire as Mrs. Patterson, a widow whose son served in the Pacific, handed guards a basket of baked goods specifically for the German prisoners. Her face showed no hatred, only the practical kindness of a woman who believed feeding people was simply what decent humans did. The pies were revelation incarnate. Flaky crusts that crumbled at touch, sweet filling that spoke of sugar rationing that barely existed, fruit harvested from trees that grew in peaceful abundance. Werner wept over his slice, remembering when apples were luxury items traded on black markets for impossible prices. Heinrich couldn't comprehend the civilian generosity. Enemy families, whose sons fought German armies, donated food to German prisoners. The contradiction shattered every propaganda lesson about American hatred and revenge. These people possessed abundance, so vast they could afford kindness toward those who had killed their soldiers. Mr. Johnson, a local farmer whose fields stretched to the horizon, brought fresh vegetables that prisoners hadn't seen in years. Tomatoes red as blood, corn so sweet it seemed impossible, potatoes without spots or mold. He spoke broken German, learned from grandparents, treating prisoners like neighbors rather than enemies. Dieter experienced cultural shock watching American children play near the fence. Well-fed, laughing, wearing clothes without patches, carrying toys that were manufactured rather than carved from scraps. Their casual abundance was more devastating than any battle footage. A local church group arrived on Sundays, singing hymns and distributing care packages. The irony was profound. Christian Americans showing mercy to German soldiers, while German churches preached hatred of Allied forces. The same God, different interpretations, opposite results. Guard Sergeant Miller organized informal exchanges where prisoners demonstrated German crafts, while civilians shared American traditions. Werner taught bread-making techniques to fascinated housewives. Klaus carved wooden toys that amazed local children. Heinrich shared folk songs that transcended language barriers. The community involvement accelerated ideological collapse. These weren't propaganda displays designed to impress prisoners. These were genuine expressions of abundance, so natural that Americans couldn't imagine withholding kindness even from enemies. One evening, young Tommy Patterson slipped chocolate bars through the fence while his mother wasn't watching. His whispered explanation broke Klaus completely. "Mama says everyone gets hungry, even bad guys, and hungry isn't fair." From the mouth of an 80-year-old came wisdom that demolished years of military indoctrination. If children understood universal humanity better than generals, what did that say about the war itself? Werner saved every gift, every photograph, every moment of kindness, not as souvenirs, but as evidence for trials he knew were coming. Not legal trials, but personal reckonings with everything he'd believed about enemies, allies, and the terrible possibility that his side had been wrong about everything that mattered. News of German defeats filtered through the camp like poison in clear water. Sicily had fallen. Italy surrendered. The Wehrmacht retreated on all fronts while American production lines accelerated, pumping out ships, planes, and weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. Klaus listened to radio broadcasts with growing horror. Not horror at German losses, but horror at the implications. If America could simultaneously feed enemy prisoners chocolate while outproducing the entire Axis, what kind of industrial power had Germany challenged? The numbers were staggering when guards shared them casually. American factories produced one Liberty ship every day. Boeing rolled out bombers like automobiles. Detroit converted car plants to tank production without missing meals or reducing civilian comfort. Germany's total war economy couldn't match America's casual industrial expansion. Heinrich received devastating news from home. His brother had died retreating from Kursk. His city suffered daily bombing raids. Food rations were cut again, leaving children with barely 800 calories daily. Meanwhile, he ate American surplus that exceeded peacetime German abundance. Werner studied camp operations with professional interest, noting efficiency that German military logistics never achieved. Supply trucks arrived precisely on schedule. Equipment functioned without constant repair. Guards maintained high morale despite being stationed far from combat. American organization made German discipline look amateur. Dieter began questioning fundamental assumptions about German superiority. If Germans were the master race, why were they losing to supposedly inferior Americans? If American democracy was weak, why did it outproduce authoritarian efficiency? If racial purity mattered, why did diverse America dominate homogeneous Germany? The prisoners split into factions. Loyalists maintained faith in eventual German victory, dismissing defeats as temporary setbacks. Realists accepted that Germany was losing but blamed leadership rather than ideology. A growing third group questioned everything, wondering if their entire cause had been built on lies. Klaus found himself in dangerous territory, quietly planning post-war immigration to America. Not from cowardice, but from recognition that abundance wasn't accidental. American prosperity resulted from systems that worked, freedoms that motivated, diversity that strengthened rather than weakened society. News arrived that Hamburg was burning, Dresden devastated, Berlin under siege. German prisoners ate Thanksgiving dinner while their families huddled in bomb shelters. The psychological disconnect was becoming unbearable. Guard Captain Thompson shared newspaper photographs showing American cities untouched by war. Factories humming, schools operating, children playing in parks while their fathers fought overseas. America fought total war without sacrificing civilian life or abundance. Heinrich confronted the central question haunting all of them. If America could maintain prosperity while defeating Germany, Japan, and Italy simultaneously, what did that say about American weakness? What did it reveal about German propaganda? Werner reached his conclusion first, whispering it to Klaus during evening formation. We didn't lose because we weren't brave enough. We lost because we were wrong about everything. About them, about us, about what makes nations strong. The admission hung in autumn air like confession before execution. They'd serve an ideology that promised victory through hatred, while their enemies achieved it through abundance. Heinrich began carving toys for local American children, symbolizing transformation from enemy to human. His hands, which once assembled aircraft instruments for bombing Allied cities, now shaped wooden horses and dolls with delicate precision that amazed everyone watching. The irony wasn't lost on him. These same fingers had helped build machines designed to kill American children. Now they created joy for those same children, fashioning gifts from which scraps donated by generous civilians who knew exactly who was making them. Klaus watched Heinrich work, understanding the deeper meaning. Each careful cut of the knife was an act of penance, an attempt to build something instead of destroy. The children's delighted faces when receiving these handmade treasures proved more effective than any punishment in changing hearts and minds. Werner joined the carving sessions, teaching other prisoners techniques learned in his father's workshop. Soon, a small industry emerged within the camp. German soldiers creating beauty for American families, using skills that war had tried to pervert for destruction. Mrs. Patterson's grandson Tommy became Heinrich's most enthusiastic customer, visiting the fence weekly to collect new wooden animals. His innocent questions about Germany, asked without fear or hatred, forced Heinrich to confront his homeland through a child's eyes. "Why did your soldiers want to hurt people?" Tommy asked one afternoon, clutching a wooden bear Heinrich had spent days perfecting. The question was devastating in its simplicity, cutting through propaganda to reach fundamental moral truth. Heinrich struggled to answer. How could he explain ideology that made sense only within systems built on lies? How could he justify actions that seemed reasonable until viewed through abundance and kindness? The other prisoners watched these exchanges with growing recognition. Kindness proved more effective than force in changing human nature. These American civilians accomplished what no military defeat could achieve: genuine transformation of enemy consciousness. Dieter began teaching German folk songs to local church choirs, creating cultural bridges that transcended wartime hatred. His voice, which once sang Nazi anthems, now shared beautiful melodies that revealed common humanity beneath political differences. Guard Sergeant Miller organized formal presentations where prisoners demonstrated traditional German crafts while explaining their peaceful origins. The community learned about cuckoo clocks, beer brewing, woodworking techniques that had nothing to do with military aggression. Klaus realized that carving toys was his first creative act in years. Military service had reduced him to destroying, following orders, serving machinery designed for death. Here, making children smile, he remembered what it felt like to build rather than break. The transformation was visible to everyone. Prisoners walked taller, smiled more often, spoke with less bitterness about their situation. Creating beauty instead of participating in destruction healed psychological wounds that military discipline had opened. Heinrich's masterpiece was a complete nativity set carved for the local church's Christmas display. German hands creating symbols of peace for American Christians who welcomed the gift despite knowing its makers had recently been enemies. The symbolism was profound. Enemies becoming creators, warriors becoming artists, hatred transforming into love through the simple act of making something beautiful for children who represented hope rather than fear. Spring 1945 arrived with repatriation announcements that should have brought joy, but instead filled prisoners with complex dread. The war was ending, Germany collapsing, and soon they would return to a homeland that existed more in memory than reality. Klaus received letters describing Munich as a moonscape of rubble, where families lived in basements and foraged for food among ruins. The city of his birth had become an archaeological site, where children played among bomb craters and adults searched debris for anything edible or burnable. Heinrich faced an impossible choice: return to a bombed wasteland where his children barely survived on charity rations, or somehow remain in a land of abundance where even prisoners ate better than German civilians. The decision tortured him nightly. Werner's wife wrote that their bakery neighborhood no longer existed. Streets were gone, replaced by craters and collapsed buildings. The ovens he'd dreamed of rebuilding had been vaporized along with everything he'd worked to create before the war, changed everything. The American guards understood the prisoner's dilemma. Captain Thompson shared intelligence reports describing German cities where starvation was widespread, infrastructure destroyed, economic systems collapsed. Returning meant trading abundance for apocalypse. Dieter made his choice explicit, requesting asylum despite knowing the complications. "I cannot return to starve when I have seen what abundance looks like," he told the camp interpreter. "My family will understand when I bring them here eventually." Klaus wrestled with loyalty versus survival, patriotism versus practicality. Germany needed rebuilding, but America offered opportunity. His skills could help reconstruct his homeland, but his future lay in a country that had shown him what prosperity actually meant. The transformation was complete for many prisoners. They no longer saw themselves as German soldiers temporarily detained, but as men who had glimpsed a better way of living and couldn't unsee it. Chocolate and peanut butter had accomplished what propaganda never could: genuine conversion. Heinrich began learning English seriously, studying with guard Miller, who encouraged his efforts. The language lessons weren't just practical preparation. They represented psychological commitment to a new identity in a land that had redefined his understanding of human possibility. Warner started documenting American baking techniques, planning to return to Germany, but carrying knowledge that might help rebuild not just his business, but his country's relationship with abundance and efficiency. Some prisoners chose repatriation from duty, others from homesickness, but a significant number quietly began exploring immigration possibilities. The camp had become a preview of American life that made returning to devastation seem like choosing darkness over light. Mrs. Patterson's final gift was perhaps the most significant: photographs of the prisoners working, carving, laughing, creating. Visual proof that enemies could become friends, that hatred could transform into cooperation, that abundance shared created more abundance. The spring of 1945 forced decisions that would echo through decades: return to rebuild from ruins or emigrate toward abundance, honor the past or embrace the future. The choice would define not just individual lives, but the meaning of their entire war experience. Final preparations for return to Germany began with heavy hearts and heavier questions. The prisoners packed few possessions, but carried memories that would weigh more than any physical cargo. Wooden toys they'd carved, photographs from American families, letters of recommendation for guards who'd become friends rather than captors. Klaus folded his camp clothes carefully, knowing they were better quality than anything waiting for him in Munich's ruins. His small bundle included English phrases written on scraps of paper, chocolate bars saved for the journey, and addresses of Pennsylvania families who'd promised to sponsor his eventual return. Heinrich struggled most with leaving. His children's letters described hunger, so severe they couldn't concentrate in school. Meanwhile, he'd gained weight in captivity, eating better than he had during peacetime. The guilt was crushing, but the knowledge was transformative. Warner packed his notebook filled with American baking techniques, efficiency methods, and management principles he'd observed. The irony struck him daily. He was returning to rebuild Germany using lessons learned from enemies who defeated them through abundance rather than brutality. The farewell ceremonies revealed how completely relationships had changed. Guard Sergeant Miller shook hands with each prisoner personally, sharing addresses and promising to write. Mrs. Patterson brought final care packages for the journey, treating enemy soldiers like departing family members. Tommy Patterson cried when saying goodbye to Heinrich, clutching the last wooden toy he'd received. "Will you come back to visit us?" the boy asked innocently, not understanding the complexities of international travel and immigration policies that made such reunions unlikely. Captain Thompson's final speech acknowledged the unusual nature of their imprisonment. "You came here as enemies," he said, "but you leave as men who've seen what cooperation can accomplish. Use that knowledge to build something better than what was destroyed." The bus ride to the departure port was silent, except for occasional German conversations about what they'd witnessed. America wasn't just another country. It was proof that different systems produced different results. Abundance wasn't accidental, but systematic. Klaus carried letters from American families offering employment if he could return legally. The network of relationships built through kindness might someday become pathways back to the land that had redefined his understanding of human possibility. Dieter had made his choice definitive, filing official asylum paperwork despite family pressure to return. "I've seen paradise," he wrote to his parents. "I cannot unsee it. When you taste abundance, hunger becomes unbearable." Warner's final act was giving his wooden carving tools to Tommy Patterson, telling Mrs. Patterson to encourage the boys' creativity. The gesture symbolized hope that future generations might build rather than destroy, create rather than conquer. Heinrich packed his English dictionary and grammar books alongside German documents, preparing for a life that might span 2 countries and 2 languages. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. As they boarded ships bound for devastated Europe, the prisoners carried more than personal belongings. They carried evidence that abundance was possible, that former enemies could become friends, that kindness was more powerful than force in changing human hearts. Repatriation ships carried them back across the Atlantic toward a Germany that existed more in memory than reality. Klaus stood at the rail watching America's coastline disappear, knowing he was leaving abundance for devastation, hope for despair, future for ruins that might never fully heal. The contrast was immediate upon arrival. German ports showed war's true cost. Shattered docks, sunken ships, crowds of displaced persons searching for family members who might no longer exist. The prisoners disembarked into a landscape that made their captivity seem like paradise by comparison. Heinrich reunited with children so thin he barely recognized them. Their joy at his return was overshadowed by the reality that he'd eaten better as a prisoner than they had as civilians. The guilt would haunt him forever, but the knowledge would drive him toward creating something better. Werner found his Munich neighborhood erased from existence. Where his bakery once stood, only rubble remained. But his notebook filled with American techniques would help him rebuild not just a business, but an understanding of what prosperity actually required. Years passed. The transformed prisoners scattered across a divided Germany, carrying memories of abundance that seemed increasingly impossible to share. Who would believe that enemy captors had fed them chocolate while German children starved? Who would understand that kindness had accomplished what force never could? But evidence accumulated. Klaus returned to Pennsylvania in 1952, sponsored by Sergeant Miller's family. His immigration paperwork cited skills learned in American captivity, relationships built through shared humanity across enemy lines, and knowledge that Germany needed but America had perfected. Heinrich eventually brought his family to Pennsylvania, using English learned from Guard Miller and connections maintained through years of correspondence. His children grew up eating peanut butter sandwiches, never fully understanding why their father wept the first time he watched them casually discard half-eaten meals. Werner rebuilt his bakery using American efficiency methods, creating prosperity that seemed impossible in post-war Germany. His success attracted attention from neighbors who couldn't understand how a former prisoner had learned such effective techniques from supposed enemies. Dieter's asylum was eventually approved. He married an American woman, raised children who spoke both languages, and spent decades trying to explain how chocolate and peanut butter had saved his soul by destroying his ideology. The camp in Pennsylvania became farmland again, but the transformation it created echoed through generations. Former prisoners who'd tasted abundance never forgot the lesson. Nations that feed their enemies possess power that military force alone cannot achieve. Statistics confirmed what individual stories suggested. Of the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners held in American camps, a significant percentage emigrated after the war. They came seeking not just opportunity, but the abundance they'd witnessed, the kindness they'd experienced, the proof that different systems produce different results. In decades to come, these men would tell their grandchildren stories not of battles or ideology, but of chocolate that changed everything, of peanut butter that revealed truth, of abundance that proved more powerful than propaganda, in transforming human hearts and reshaping understanding of what enemies could become when treated with dignity rather than revenge.